His last wish was to say goodbye to his dog. Then this happened. The courtroom was cloaked in a suffocating silence, the kind that pressed against the ears like an invisible weight. Matthew Carter sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with exhaustion. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in harmony with the low murmur of voices behind him. Every whisper and shuffle seemed amplified in his ears, a constant reminder of the stakes before him. His fingers drummed idly on the surface of the table, betraying the nervous energy coursing through his veins. Today might very well decide the course of his life. The judge cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention to the bench. His gavel rested lightly in his hand, an unspoken promise of order and finality. Mr. Carter, before we proceed, I've been informed you've made a special request. Matthew straightened, the motion heavy with resignation. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse and frayed. Yes, Your Honor. I would like to see Titan, my dog. A ripple of surprise swept through the spectators. Some exchanged puzzled glances. Others sat frozen, their curiosity piqued. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly hesitant, but after a moment's pause, he gestured toward the bailiff. Bring the dog in. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and all eyes turned as an officer entered, holding the leash of a large German shepherd. Titan stepped forward, his movements deliberate and strong, yet his amber eyes scanned the room with focused intensity. As soon as he spotted Matthew, his demeanor shifted. His tail wagged with a restrained fervor, and he let out a low, excited whine. Matthew rose to his feet, his composure cracking like brittle glass. His breath hitched as Titan broke free from the officer's hold and bounded toward him. Kneeling, Matthew met the dog halfway, his arms encircling the familiar, sturdy frame. Titan responded by pressing his head firmly against Matthew's chest, a deep, contented rumble vibrating through him. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Spectators stared, their faces softening. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, his features unreadable. I missed you, boy, Matthew whispered, his voice trembling. His fingers wove through Titan's thick fur, grounding himself in the dog's presence. For a brief, unguarded moment, the weight of the trial, the accusations, the potential years behind bars, all of it seemed to dissolve. Titan stepped back, his eyes locking onto Matthew's face as if trying to communicate something unspoken. Then, with a sudden determination, he sniffed the air, his focus shifting to Matthew's coat pocket. Without hesitation, the dog pawed at the fabric, his movements insistent. What is it, Titan? Matthew asked, bewildered. He reached into the pocket, his fingers brushing against a crumpled piece of paper he hadn't noticed before. Frowning, he pulled it out and unfolded it, revealing its contents. A series of typed addresses and a name he knew too well, John Everett. The name was circled in bold, alongside a scrawled note, Warehouse number 17, Fire Records. Matthew froze. His lawyer, Melissa Hayes, leaned in sharply. Let me see that, she demanded, plucking the paper from his hand. Her sharp eyes scanned the page, her expression hardening with every passing second. Your Honor, Melissa said, rising to her feet. Her tone was controlled but edged with urgency. I request an immediate recess. This document could contain critical evidence related to my client's case. The judge, visibly intrigued, gestured for her to approach. As Melissa handed over the paper, the courtroom buzzed with hushed speculation. Titan sat calmly at Matthew's side, his gaze unwavering as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The judge studied the paper, his face betraying flickers of surprise. Finally, he nodded. Very well. This trial will adjourn until the document's authenticity can be verified. Court will reconvene in 3 days. A collective murmur swept through the room as the gavel struck. Melissa turned to Matthew, her eyes sharp with determination. This could be our chance, she said, clutching the paper tightly. If this information is real, it might prove you were framed. Matthew glanced down at Titan, who gazed up at him with a calm assurance. For the first time in weeks, a fragile ember of hope sparked in his chest. As the bailiff prepared to escort Matthew back to custody, he knelt beside Titan once more. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how, but you might have just saved my life." Titan licked his face, his tail wagging, and the bond between man and dog spoke volumes, resonating with every witness in the room. The courtroom was an ocean of silence, its weight pressing down on the room as though it could crush those within. Every cough, every shuffle of paper, seemed to bounce off the dark wooden walls, amplifying the tension. In the center of it all, Matthew Carter sat at the defendant's table, his posture slumped with exhaustion and despair. His fingers idly traced the edge of the table, an unconscious outlet for his fraying nerves. His pale face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with sleepless nights and the burden of an uncertain future. Today, this trial might seal his fate. Embezzlement, the charge leveled against him, carried the potential to destroy the life he had built piece by painstaking piece. He had insisted on his innocence, but the evidence was damning, and the courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like the jaws of a trap. The judge presiding over the case, a stoic man with an impassive expression, adjusted his glasses and rapped his gavel lightly to signal the room's attention. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to issuing verdicts that could change lives, "I have been informed of your unusual request. Do you still wish to proceed with it?" Matthew raised his eyes, his expression hollow but his voice firm despite the tremor that threatened to betray him. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his words breaking the heavy stillness. "I would like to see Titan, my dog, one last time." A murmur rippled through the room, spectators exchanging puzzled glances, while some leaned forward in their seats. What kind of request was this? What place did sentimentality have in a courtroom where justice was meant to reign supreme? The judge's expression betrayed a flicker of curiosity, but he quickly masked it, nodding toward the bailiff. "Very well. Bring in the dog," he instructed, his tone tempered with skepticism. The heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom creaked open, and every head turned to see a German shepherd stride in, his gait confident yet measured. Titan's amber eyes scanned the room, sharp and alert, taking in every face with an intelligence that seemed to exceed the ordinary. At the sight of Matthew, his demeanor shifted, his ears perked, and his tail wagged with restrained joy. With a tug on the leash that surprised the officer holding him, Titan broke free and bounded toward his owner. Matthew stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and fell to his knees as the dog leapt into his arms. The embrace was immediate and heartfelt, man and animal reunited in a moment that seemed to transcend the somber reality of their surroundings. Matthew buried his face in Titan's thick fur, his shoulders shaking as tears spilled freely. He didn't care that he was in full view of strangers, his vulnerability on display. Titan nuzzled his head against Matthew, letting out a soft whine that carried the weight of shared longing and loyalty. The room fell silent as the spectators watched the scene unfold, their previous curiosity giving way to something deeper, empathy. Even the judge seemed to hesitate, his gavel hovering over its base as he studied the reunion with an unreadable expression. "I missed you, boy," Matthew murmured, his voice trembling. His hands moved through Titan's fur as though memorizing every inch, every texture. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Titan leaned into him, his body pressing close, as if offering the comfort and strength Matthew so desperately needed. For a fleeting moment, the crushing weight of his trial, the accusations, and the years of potential imprisonment faded into the background. There was only Titan, his steadfast companion, and the warmth of a bond forged through years of trust and love. Then, without warning, Titan stepped back. His ears twitched, his nose working the air, and he lowered his head slightly, his focus narrowing to Matthew's coat pocket. The shift in the dog's behavior was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew him well. "What is it, boy?" Matthew asked, confused. Titan pawed at the pocket insistently, his movements deliberate. Frowning, Matthew reached inside and retrieved a crumpled piece of paper he hadn't noticed before. He unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he read the contents. A hush fell over the room as the defense attorney, Melissa Hayes, rose to her feet, her sharp eyes catching the change in Matthew's demeanor. "What is it?" she asked, striding toward him. Matthew handed her the paper, his voice a mixture of bewilderment and urgency. I don't know where this came from. Titan found it." Melissa took the paper and scanned it quickly, her expression hardening as the implications sank in. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm and commanding, "this document could be critical evidence. I request an immediate recess to verify its authenticity." The judge leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. He gestured for her to approach and handed the paper to the clerk for inspection. As he scanned the page, his expression shifted subtly, his neutral facade giving way to traces of surprise and curiosity. The courtroom buzzed with whispered speculation as the tension climbed. "Order," the judge said, his gavel striking the sound block with a sharp crack. "This trial will adjourn until this document can be thoroughly examined. Court will reconvene in 3 days." The decision sent a ripple of murmurs through the room, the atmosphere charged with renewed uncertainty. Melissa turned back to Matthew, her face a mixture of determination and cautious optimism. "This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for," she said, clutching the paper as though it were a lifeline. "If this information holds up, it might prove you were framed." Matthew's gaze dropped to Titan, who sat calmly at his side, his amber eyes reflecting an almost human understanding. Matthew reached out, placing a hand on the dog's head. "Good boy," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how you knew, but you've always had a way of protecting me, haven't you?" Titan wagged his tail, the gesture subdued but full of reassurance. As the bailiff approached to escort Matthew back to the holding area, he hesitated, unwilling to part from Titan. He knelt down one last time, holding the dog close. "Hang in there, buddy," he whispered. "We'll get through this." Titan licked his face, his silent promise of loyalty unshaken. The officer gently led the dog away, and Matthew watched as Titan disappeared through the courtroom doors, leaving behind an emptiness that settled like a weight in his chest. The courtroom emptied slowly, the spectators lingering, reluctant to leave the scene that had just unfolded. Whispers filled the air, speculation mingling with admiration for the dog that had turned the tide of the trial. Melissa gathered her files, her mind racing with possibilities as she prepared to verify the document's authenticity. She glanced at the empty space where Titan had stood moments ago and felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about clearing Matthew's name. It was about uncovering a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. Meanwhile, in the holding area, Matthew sat on the edge of his cot, his mind replaying the events of the day. The image of Titan pawing at his pocket lingered, filling him with equal parts wonder and unease. Who had placed that document there? And why? He thought of Titan's unwavering loyalty, the way the dog had always seemed to sense what he needed even before he did. Perhaps, he thought, there was something more to this connection, something he couldn't yet explain. Across town, Melissa sat in her office, the document spread out before her as she combed through its contents. The details were damning, references to a warehouse fire, financial transactions, and the name John Everett, a man whose power and influence loomed large in Matthew's case. Her gut told her they were on the brink of uncovering something monumental, something that could not only exonerate Matthew, but expose a network of corruption far larger than they had imagined. As she picked up her phone to make the first of many calls, she thought of Titan, the dog whose instincts had set this chain of events in motion, and felt a renewed sense of hope. Back in his cell, Matthew lay down, the cool metal cot pressing against his back. He closed his eyes, his thoughts returning to Titan, the dog who had been his partner in life's darkest moments. "Thank you, boy," he whispered to the empty room. Somewhere out there, Titan was waiting for him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Matthew allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, They would have a chance to walk out of this nightmare together. Matthew sat on the edge of the thin mattress in his cell, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clasped together as he stared at the scuffed floor beneath his feet. The cold, fluorescent light overhead cast sharp shadows, and the faint hum of distant footsteps echoed through the sterile halls. Time felt meaningless here, stretched thin and heavy. He had spent the past hours replaying every moment in the courtroom. The unexpected reunion with Titan, the mysterious document, and the guarded optimism in Melissa's voice when she'd said they were onto something. That glimmer of hope was enough to keep him holding on, though it was a fragile thread stretched taut under the weight of uncertainty. He thought of Titan's unwavering loyalty, the way the dog had acted with a purpose that seemed almost beyond reason, and he couldn't help but feel that something larger was at play. But what? The question haunted him, as did the uneasy sense that someone might try to silence them before the truth could come to light. Meanwhile, Melissa sat in her dimly lit apartment, her laptop glowing against the darkness as she scrolled through the photos she'd taken at the warehouse. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, typing search queries into legal databases and private archives. The incident report she had found confirmed the suspicions she'd harbored since the moment she first read the crumpled document Titan had uncovered. The warehouse fire had been no accident. It was deliberate, a calculated move to destroy records that could implicate John Everett and his network of associates in a web of corruption, fraud, and, most damningly, human and animal exploitation. The phrases in the report were carefully worded, filled with bureaucratic doublespeak, but Melissa had spent enough time in this world to read between the lines. She recognized the fingerprints of someone with immense power and the willingness to use it without conscience. Her phone buzzed on the table, the sound startling in the quiet room. Picking it up, she saw a message from a blocked number. "Stop digging. For your own good." Melissa stared at the screen, her heart pounding as the implication set in. Whoever had sent it knew what she was doing, and they wanted her to stop. But if they thought a veiled threat would scare her off, they didn't know her at all. She deleted the message, though its shadow lingered in her thoughts. Fear was clawing at the edges of her resolve, but she pushed it down. This was about more than just her or even Matthew. If the truth came out, it could dismantle a system built on lies and exploitation. As she reviewed the files again, a particular photograph caught her eye. It was an image from the aftermath of the warehouse fire, showing charred remains and scattered debris. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a figure, a young German shepherd, chained and emaciated but unmistakably alive. Melissa's breath caught in her throat as she recognized Titan. The timestamp on the photo aligned perfectly with the timeline in the report. Titan wasn't just a bystander to Everett's crimes. He was a survivor, one of the lives nearly erased by the fire and the atrocities it had concealed. That realization sent a chill down her spine. Titan's scars, his uncanny instincts, everything made sense now. He had lived through the worst of Everett's cruelty, and somehow, he had come out of it not just alive but determined to protect the people who mattered to him. Melissa leaned back in her chair, the weight of the discovery settling over her like a heavy blanket. She thought of Matthew, trapped in a cell and entirely dependent on her ability to unravel this conspiracy. And she thought of Titan, whose actions had already turned the tide once and whose past might now be the key to exposing Everett. But they were racing against the clock. Melissa had pieced together enough of the puzzle to form a plan. She grabbed her bag, her laptop, and the printouts she had made of the most damning evidence. The next step was clear. She needed leverage. A single report, no matter how incriminating, wouldn't be enough to take down someone as powerful as Everett. But a witness, someone who could testify to his crimes and corroborate the evidence, could tip the scales. Her mind returned to the name she had found buried in the warehouse files. Paul Delgado, a former employee who had been listed as a witness in the initial investigation but had vanished shortly after the fire. If she could find him, he might hold the final piece of the puzzle. Melissa spent the morning combing through public records, cross-referencing addresses and phone numbers until she found a lead. Delgado was living off the grid, but a series of financial transactions suggested he might be hiding in a small cabin outside the city. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough. She grabbed her keys and headed out, her resolve solidifying with every mile she drove. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, nearly swallowed by the dense canopy of trees. Melissa parked a short distance away and approached cautiously, her footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. The place had the look of someone trying to disappear. Overgrown bushes, curtains drawn tight, and a faint air of neglect. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding as she waited. For a moment, there was only silence, and she thought she had made the trip for nothing. But then the door creaked open, and a man peered out, his face pale and lined with fear. "Paul Delgado?" Melissa asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. The man hesitated, his eyes darting around as though he expected someone to jump out of the shadows. "Who's asking?" he said, his tone wary. "My name is Melissa Hayes. I'm an attorney working on a case connected to the warehouse fire 2 years ago. I need your help." Delgado's expression darkened, and he started to close the door. "I don't know anything about that." "Wait," Melissa said quickly, holding up the photo of Titan. "You were there. You saw what happened, didn't you? This dog, he survived because of you." That gave Delgado pause. His eyes flicked to the photo, and something in his expression softened. "That dog," he murmured, his voice trailing off. He opened the door wider, though his wariness didn't fade entirely. "Come inside, but keep your voice down." Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional, with mismatched furniture and stacks of newspapers covering the floor.
Delgado gestured for her to sit.
And she wasted no time laying out the evidence she had gathered. As she spoke, his initial reluctance gave way to a quiet resolve, his shoulders sagging under the weight of memories he had tried to bury. "I didn't know how bad it was," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "At first, I thought it was just business. Shady. Sure, but nothing like what it turned out to be. When I found out what they were doing, what they were using that warehouse for, I tried to leave. But Everett doesn't let people walk away. I saw what they did to the records, and I saw what they did to the dogs. They set the fire to wipe it all clean. And Titan?" Melissa pressed, her heart aching as she imagined what he must have endured. "He was chained up with the others," Delgado said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't save them all, but I got him out. I thought he'd died after that. I didn't think." Melissa leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You can help us take Everett down. With your testimony, we can make sure he never hurts anyone else again." Delgado hesitated, his fear warring with the guilt etched into his face. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do it, but you'd better be ready, because Everett won't go down without a fight." As Melissa left the cabin, her chest tightened with a mix of determination and dread. The battle ahead would be dangerous, but for Matthew, Titan, and all the lives Everett had destroyed, it was a fight worth taking on. The truth was no longer just a goal, it was their only chance at justice. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, and the air charged with anticipation. The final day of Matthew Carter's trial had arrived, and the stakes had never been higher. Whispers rippled through the crowd like an undercurrent as people speculated on what might unfold. The tension was palpable, a nearly tangible weight pressing down on everyone present. At the defense table, Matthew sat beside Melissa Hayes, his face a study in restrained anxiety. Despite the immense pressure, there was a quiet resolve in his demeanor, a glimmer of hope that had been reignited over the past few days. Beside him, Titan lay calmly, his steady presence a reminder of the bond that had brought them this far. The judge entered the courtroom, and the gavel struck sharply, silencing the room. "Court is now in session," he announced. "Counselor Hayes, you may proceed with your presentation of the new evidence." Melissa rose, her movements deliberate, and stepped forward to address the court. "Your Honor, over the past 72 hours, my team and I have uncovered critical evidence that exonerates my client and directly implicates another party, Mr. John Everett. in a range of criminal activities, including the orchestration of a fraudulent case against Mr. Carter. A murmur swept through the room at the mention of Everett's name, whispered about in legal and political circles but never publicly accused. Melissa continued, unfazed by the crowd's reaction. We have brought forward a witness, a former employee of Mr. Everett, who can corroborate this evidence and testify to the crimes that led to this trial. The courtroom doors opened, and all eyes turned to see Paul Delgado enter, escorted by a bailiff. His face was pale but determined, and he avoided looking at the crowd as he made his way to the stand. Melissa's voice was steady as she began questioning him, carefully guiding him through his testimony. Delgado recounted the events leading up to the warehouse fire, describing in vivid detail the operation Everett had run there, illegal financial dealings, fraudulent record-keeping, and, most hauntingly, the abuse and destruction of animals used as test subjects or guards. The room was silent except for the sound of Delgado's voice, which trembled slightly as he described the fire. I saw Everett's men pouring accelerant, he said, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. They wanted to erase everything, records, evidence, even the lives inside. Titan was one of the few survivors. I got him out, but... His voice broke, and he swallowed hard before continuing. But I couldn't save the others. Melissa placed a photograph of Titan as a young, emaciated dog into evidence, showing the court the undeniable connection between the German Shepherd and the atrocities Delgado had described. Titan's actions have proved as vital as any human witness in bringing the truth to light. John Everett's lawyer stood to object, but the judge cut him off. The evidence speaks for itself, he said firmly. The courtroom was riveted as Melissa continued presenting her case. She detailed how Everett had manipulated financial records to frame Matthew, using the stolen funds to cover up his own crimes. The paper Titan had found in Matthew's pocket, Melissa revealed, had been planted by someone inside Everett's organization, either a warning or a mistake. Either way, it had been the key to unraveling everything. When the prosecution attempted to cross-examine Delgado, his resolve didn't waver. He answered every question with clarity, his voice growing steadier as he realized the truth was finally being heard. Everett didn't just frame Matthew, he said. He's been doing this for years, destroying anyone who gets in his way. By the time Melissa rested her case, the mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a straightforward embezzlement trial had become a damning exposé of corruption and cruelty. Even the judge, who had remained stoic throughout the proceedings, seemed visibly affected as he announced a recess for deliberations. Matthew leaned over to Melissa, his voice low. "Do you think it's enough?" he asked, his uncertainty plain despite the progress they'd made. Melissa placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "It's more than enough," she said. "You've been fighting this battle for so long, but now the truth is finally on your side." Titan, as if sensing the importance of the moment, nudged Matthew's leg with his nose. Matthew smiled faintly and reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, drawing strength from the simple, familiar gesture. "We wouldn't have made it without you, boy," he murmured. Titan's tail wagged slowly, his calm presence grounding Matthew as they waited for the verdict. When the judge returned, the room fell silent once more. Having reviewed the new evidence and testimony, he began, his voice deliberate. "This court finds Mr. Matthew Carter not guilty of the charges brought against him. Furthermore, I am issuing a motion to investigate Mr. John Everett for crimes including perjury, fraud, and obstruction of justice." The gavel struck, and the room erupted. Applause and murmurs of relief filled the air as Matthew sat in stunned silence, the weight of months of fear and uncertainty lifting in an instant. Titan stood and leaned against him, as though to anchor him in the reality of the moment. Melissa smiled, her expression a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. "You're free, Matthew," she said simply, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe it. As they stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight, reporters swarmed them, microphones and cameras thrust forward, voices clamoring for statements. Melissa shielded Matthew as best she could, but it was Titan who stole the spotlight. The dog stood tall and calm, his scars and steady gaze telling a story that needed no words. People pointed and whispered, moved by the sight of the animal who had not only survived but had played a crucial role in exposing the truth. Matthew knelt beside Titan, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck as flashes went off around them. "We did it," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Titan licked his face, and Matthew laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy that he hadn't felt in months. Later that evening, as the chaos of the day subsided, Matthew sat on the steps of his small house, Titan lying at his feet. Melissa had stayed for a while to go over next steps, but now it was just the two of them, the quiet night wrapping around them like a warm blanket. "You know," Matthew said, glancing down at Titan, "when this all started, I thought I'd lost everything. But you never gave up on me, did you?" Titan looked up at him, his amber eyes filled with that unshakable loyalty that had carried them through every trial. Matthew reached down and ran a hand through the dog's fur, his chest tightening with gratitude. "You're more than just my dog, Titan," he said softly. "You're my family." For the first time in a long time, Matthew felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over. Everett's empire would take time to dismantle, and there were still battles ahead, but for now, he had his freedom, his loyal companion, and the chance to rebuild. As the stars began to dot the sky above, Matthew leaned back against the steps, his hand resting on Titan's head. Together, they watched the night unfold, ready to face whatever came next, side by side. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this incredible story of loyalty, truth, and justice. If it moved you as much as it did us, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable stories. We can't wait to see you again in our next adventure.